So an exercise I've been meaning to try out is taking a look at one of my own old artworks and then trying to see if I can analyze all the mistakes and if I can figure out ways to fix them. And I guess this is the artwork we'll be taking a look at. This is from a couple of years ago, and it actually doesn't look too bad, even though it's complete garbage. And before we get started, Xencelabs sent me their Pen Display 24 Plus, which I'll be unboxing and using throughout the video. Alright, here is Xencelabs' Pen Display 24 Plus. This is one of their, well, I guess this is their most top-of-the-line tablet. They sent this to me for unboxing and review. And out of all the tablets I've tried out, which if you've been following the channel for a while, you've probably seen all the tablets I've tried out, this is probably my favorite. It's a really good tablet. Specifically, the way it draws is really nice. None of the other tablets I've tried out have had the same drawing feel. Whenever I'm drawing my lines slowly on this tablet, there's still a lot of shakiness to it, obviously, but I can actually make my lines go exactly where they need to go, which is something I haven't really had with any of the other tablets. They are all accurate, of course, but this one is kind of next level. On the website, it says the screen has a super agey etching surface, which I guess that's the gimmick that allows it to be so accurate and feel so good to draw on. Now, this tablet comes with 4 cables. We have USB-C to C, we have A to C, DisplayPort to DisplayPort, and then HDMI to HDMI. These cables are all really long. I didn't measure it, but they're all around 2 meters, except for this one, because that's the charging cable for the remote. And the remote is their shortcut key device, which I'm showing off here. It actually feels really solid. I personally don't use it because I prefer using a keyboard, but if you want to use the shortcut keys, you definitely can. It comes with 9 buttons, and then you can switch between, I think, 4 different modes, so you have a bunch of shortcuts you can use. Then for the pens, we have the regular one with 3 buttons and then the eraser at the top. I tend to not use this one because I actually prefer the thin pen, which is this one. This stylus is really good, but there's one like very small issue I have with it, where sometimes if you tilt it too much, the rim of the stylus will end up touching the screen instead of the tip, which will prevent you from drawing anything, of course. So I feel like maybe it should not have been like that sharp of an angle between the two. And then here's the actual tablet. This is a 4K 24-inch tablet, obviously. And in the back, you have the stand included, which you can actually take off and then screw in a display arm if you want. Now, one of the things they say is that this is also Calman ready built in, meaning you can use the Calman software to color calibrate it. So if you have access to that resource, then that's another plus. But that's it for the unboxing, so let's get to drawing. So when you're trying to study an artwork, or I guess analyze an artwork, sometimes it's more beneficial to look at the sketch than it is to look at the finished artwork, because the sketch contains all of the guidelines that you use to make the whole drawing. And drawing in general is about taking guidelines, or essentially just taking these simplified forms and then stacking them on top of each other and building slightly more complex forms out of them. During the sketching phase, or well, I guess this is just called using construction. And during the sketching phase, this construction is constantly being applied. The guidelines are essentially building the entire drawing, meaning if the guidelines are incorrect, it doesn't really matter what you do with the rest of the drawing, it's still going to look really bad. And in this case, the most basic guidelines I used looked like this, I guess, which that's pretty bad. So no wonder it turned out the way it did. But this time, instead of just looking at the sketch, I think I'm also going to look at the finished piece, because there are some line work issues with this that I also want to point out. Now, the first thing I want to draw attention to are all of the forms in this drawing that have inconsistent widths. The biggest offender would probably be the laces. This top lace is way wider than the one at the bottom, and then the one slightly below that has a different width than both of these. This one actually changes widths as it goes. It starts off really wide, then gets thinner. This is happening in a bunch of other places as well. Like right here on the gauntlet, we can see that this appears really thin here. This appears really thick there. This marking on the coat is really thin here, really thick there. Then this marking, for example, really thick, really thin. So you get the point. It's happening constantly throughout the entire drawing. Now, of course, things can go from thin to thick, mostly if we're talking about perspective. But unless we're talking about these huge movements through 3D space, like a ribbon that's kind of snaking through space, right here it's moving from very far into the depth to really close to us. So in this case, there's going to be a huge width discrepancy between the parts that are far away and the parts that are close to us. In this drawing, that's not the case. This lace is just as far away from us as this one. This part of the gauntlet is just as far away as this part. Same thing with the coat. This part is just as far away as this part. So it has to have a consistent width. To do that correctly, it requires some really good line control skills. I did make a video about line control recently, but this is like probably the most important art skill that people really don't work on enough. So that's mistake one, and you can actually see that with mistake with the belt too. But there's something else I want to point out about the belt, specifically this part with the buckle. I think the idea behind this belt was that it's supposed to start off with just the side facing us, and then right here in this area it kind of twists so that the side is, instead of directly facing the side, it's now facing upwards. And then I guess I figured that because it's going away from us, this part will end up being smaller. So the issue there is that foreshortening is being applied to one part of the object when it should be applied to the entire object equally. Meaning if this part is getting smaller, everything in this vicinity should be getting smaller in the exact same way as this is. And another way you can prove that it looks kind of weird is because normally a belt buckle is about this big, I want to say. And if we measure that to the rest of the leg, you could fit that in there about 2.5 times, I want to say. So comparing sizes of objects that are close to each other is a pretty good way of making sure that everything stays in proportion. And in this case, I guess the buckle would be about that big, probably. Now, another thing is that clothing has to be centered on the body. And this is kind of an asymmetric outfit, but even outfits that are asymmetrical still have to be centered. So even if you're dealing with an asymmetric outfit like this, where one part of it is really short and then one part of it is really long, it still has to be centered around the body's center line. In this case, the asymmetry would have to be centered around it. It is kind of hard to explain. Now, the torso center line, we can actually follow the line from the belly button up. We can see that the laces, at least the parts where they cross, don't line up with that center line when they should line up with it. So to fix that, we'd have to move the entire clothing over a little bit. And then in that case, the buttons right here would probably be over at the side right there. And then the rest of the fabric would be almost invisible on that side. And then we'd have to move it a bit over on this side as well. Now, speaking of the body center line, it's also kind of incorrect, at least where the head is placed in relation to the body center line. And we can see that a lot better in the sketch. We can follow the center line up like this, and then right here it takes a very sharp curve going that way, and then the spine would be right there, I guess. Now, normally from the pit of the neck downwards, the ribcage has about a 30-degree diagonal angle. Now, when posing characters, what people tend to do is they usually want to exaggerate that curve, or well, I guess I should say you exaggerate that curve along with the pelvis to create kind of a more dynamic looking figure. But the way this exaggeration usually happens is the ribcage itself tilts backwards. The ribcage could be seen as one form, so the entire form has to tilt backwards, meaning if you want to make this angle more exaggerated, the top part of it will have to be angled down. The back portion will have to be angled this way, and then the bottom will have to be angled that way. Now, the mistake here in the sketch is that this angle at the front is not only more than 30 degrees, I'm pretty sure if you were to see a front view of this rib cage, it wouldn't just look like a normal rib cage where the center goes straight down like that. I think this would actually be slanted towards one side, and keep in mind this would be the front view. So if we want to create this particular effect, instead of exaggerating this angle, we need to tilt the rib cage upwards. To do that, I guess the easiest way would be to use a box as a guide, because it's a lot easier to keep a box proportional or have it keep the correct angles as you're moving it through space than it is compared to a rib cage. Although I think this might be a bit too much of a tilt, because if you were to add in the pelvis as well, the angle between them would look like that, which, I mean, I guess that is possible, but it might be a bit too much for this particular effect. Yeah, so in this case, the neck opening would be like right there, meaning the head would have to be tilted all the way back from right there, which kind of defeats the purpose of this particular head angle, or it doesn't have the same effect. So this box would have to be tilted a little bit less, but you get the point. That's kind of how you would figure out the angles. And speaking of the head and neck, they're also kind of in a weird spot, which you can't really see it that well in this particular image because the coat covers it. But in the sketch, it's a lot clearer. So we can see the back of the neck right here, meaning the front of the neck would have to be right around here. If we follow the center line of the torso up, the pit of the neck would have to be somewhere in this area. This doesn't line up very clearly. Then another thing that beginners tend to struggle a lot with is the hair, and I think those issues stem from either not having good enough line control or not considering the forms of the hair as three-dimensional forms. There are two forms right here where I can very clearly show the three-dimensionality of the hair not being considered. The first one right here is we have a very tiny gap in between this hair form, splitting it into two forms technically. Now there's one form here at the bottom which has a curve, and then at the top that curve doesn't exist. Instead we have lines going that way, whereas of course with the curve they're going that way. And then the second form has the lines going this way and then a curve at the bottom. But the second one isn't the issue. It's this first form. So the thing with those hair forms is that they're kind of these very thin ribbon-like forms. Meaning, if we say that this plane right here is the top plane, then right here in this area there's a transition where we go from looking at the top plane of this form to seeing the bottom plane of the form. And then usually it keeps going like that, so then eventually this ends up rotating again, so then we're seeing the top plane again. So I'm guessing the intention behind this form was we have this first curve right there, then right here we have the underside which flows into the top form, and then on this side we have the same thing. There's partially the underside there, and then same thing there. So we go from top plane to bottom plane on this side to bottom plane on that side. The difference between this form that I've drawn here and this one is specifically this top line. This line is going this way and it's going that way. It doesn't line up at all with the actual top plane of the form that I was trying to draw. So instead of it looking like this, the form looks more like this, where we have the flat top plane, then right here we have the bottom planes, and then I guess we connect these, and then you end up with kind of a bridge shape, I guess, which hair obviously does not look like this. And then this form has a different issue where the top plane does not line up with that bottom plane. The top plane ends right here at this point, but somehow the bottom plane is still continuing that way. When if you want to draw this particular transition correctly, it would have to go this way, because that would follow the same curve as the top plane. But I drew it continuing this way, meaning that there's an illogical ending to the form. So to fix this one, you'd have to continue this line going this way so that it follows the exact same trajectory as the bottom plane. Then with the bangs, there are a lot of issues going on as well. A lot of these issues I'm sure you guys have encountered yourselves. This form is going this way. These bangs are all supposed to originate from an area somewhere from the head. Now in this case, this one is coming from the side, so it's coming from somewhere in this area, meaning it has to lead back to that area in some way. So if we want to fix this, we just have to change the angle to go slightly more in that direction. Then the same mistake is going on with a lot of these bangs right here, where we can see this one sharply curve off this way, which is not leading back to its origin, which is supposed to be somewhere in this area. Same thing with this one. It's sharply curving off that way, which is not leading back to its origin. Same thing here, going off that way. So all of these would have to be fixed to kind of make them originate from this top area. Then there's another form right here that has a different issue, where, well, I guess technically this one also isn't leading back to its origin, which is supposed to be here. But the problem with this form is that it doesn't really have the correct form that a hair form should have. Because right here, it's a convex curve. On the other side, it's also a convex curve, and then both of these end up in a point. So with hair, you want to keep in mind that you always want to have that concave-convex rhythm. If you still want to have a convex form on one side and a convex form on the other side, you need to use overlap. So we have one form over here, and then there's a form going behind that first form. But to fix this particular one, we just have to make the form in the front overlap it, and then we can just do that. Now, another big thing that stands out would be these ellipses surrounding her leg. An ellipse is just a circle in perspective, in case you don't know. That's one of the, I guess, weird things that happens in perspective. But the leg is almost a perfect cylinder. It's not quite a perfect cylinder, but it's close enough to the point where if you're wearing a, I guess, circular object around your leg, like those belts that she was wearing, they will appear very cylindrical as they surround your leg. So we can basically treat these things like cylinders. Now, a weird thing that happens with cylinders is that when they are right on your line of sight, so if we say the horizon line, that's our eye level, or the height that our eyes are at. If you want to draw a cylinder that's on eye level, it's going to be a straight line. Just like how if you want to draw the top plane of a box, it's just going to be a straight line if it lines up with your eye level. But then the lower it gets, or I guess the lower it gets below your line of sight, the wider that ellipse becomes. So as we go lower, the ellipse becomes wider, until eventually all the way at the bottom, it will appear very circular. You can kind of prove this using a glass. The rim of this glass is really close to our eye level. So as you can see, this is a very skinny cylinder. But then the lower we get, the wider this cylinder becomes. And obviously the same thing applies if it was the opposite and it went above your line of sight. But this also applies to if it were horizontal instead of vertical. You can show this with a cube as well, because the front plane of a cube is a perfect square, and you can fit a perfect circle inside of a perfect square. And like I said, in perspective, circles become ellipses. So if our center of vision is right around here, and the cube lines up with that, we can't see the side plane at all. But if this thing moves to the side a little bit, all of a sudden we can see that side plane. So now we're able to draw an ellipse that looks like that. So instead of the ellipse being a perfect straight line, now it's actually visible. And then the more we move this to the side, the wider it becomes. So it's the exact same thing that I just showed with the glass. Now the way this applies to the drawing is this belt is supposed to be, an ellipse, or I guess the top plane of this belt is supposed to be an ellipse, which looks like that. And then if we draw the rest of it, it looks like this. You can pretty clearly tell that this is not a correct looking cylinder. Now the main issue being this top portion. So if we follow the bottom of the cylinder, we can see that this is following the exact same angle as her leg. So that's fine. And then if that's what we're going with, we need to make sure that the top of that cylinder is also following that same angle. So we basically have to go all the way back here where we have the exact same angle. In this case, I think we'll go like that, and that should give us a much better looking cylinder. And I think that's about all I want to cover in terms of the mistakes, but obviously there's a lot more wrong with it. I did do a quick redraw of it, and I didn't clean up any of the lines. You can see it's still kind of messy in some areas. But what is crazy is I think this took me around an hour and a half to do, whereas originally I think this took me like 6 hours. I tried to keep most of the things the exact same, but just adjusting some of the things, like for example the ribcage width is a bit smaller now compared to what it was originally. But that's it for the video. Now in case you're interested, there's a link to the Pen Display 24 Plus in the description, so you can check that out if you want. You can also join our Discord server with the link in the description. And then also let me know in the comments if you like this type of video, because I might do more of this in the future. And then I guess I'll catch you all next time.